Welcome to today's webinar. We will give other participants a few minutes to join. So we will start in about 5 minutes or less. And in the interim, I'm going to display some housekeeping matters for you to look at as we wait to be joined by more participants. So sit back, relax, and we'll start soon. As you can see, we would love to hear from you. So during the course of the webinar, do not hesitate to use the Q&A button to send in your questions to the panelists. To be a nice way to interact. A recorded version of this webinar will also be available on the website, and we'll notify you when it's ready. Now, there's a very good resource that gives you a planning checklist that you can use in setting up any justice or treatment collaboration. It does not just apply to drug treatment courts. It gives you 18 steps. The link is there. We'll send it to you at some point. And it's very helpful if you plan to set up any justice treatment collaboration. And in our conversation today, we are going to talk to the persons who were pioneers in setting up the drug treatment court, and they will share their experiences. So let us first do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the treaty lands and territory of indigenous peoples. and pay tribute to their legacy and the legacy of all the First Peoples of Canada as we strengthen ties with the communities we serve and build the future through learning. We acknowledge that the lands on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also gather on territory covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, One Palm agreement. My name is Justice Barnes. I've been told I should introduce myself. I was the first prosecutor in Canada to work in a drug treatment court, a former judge of Ontario Court of Justice, a current judge of the Superior Court of Justice, a former, or I would say founding past chair of the Canadian Association of Drug Treatment Courts, chair of the Association of Justice and Treatment Professionals, as well as the International Association of Treatment Court Professionals. And I either established or helped establish 3 different types of treatment courts. In the background is Jennifer Graham, Assistant Crown Attorney, Ontario, Andre Rivard, Duty Counsel, Legal Aid Ontario, Kim Briggs from the Elgin Therapeutic Court and Mental Health Court Diversion Program, Erin Smith from Peel Addiction Assessment and Referral Center, Jessica DeTuna from the Peel Addictions Assessment and Referral Center. And together we make the Association of Justice and Treatment Professionals, and we are your hosts and welcome you to this this webinar. You know, some 26 years ago or 30 years ago, these type of collaborations were not known, they were not common, they were not widely accepted, they were viewed with some skepticism. And legend has it that one day there was a man called Paul Bentley who was sitting behind his computer, and he was in fact one of the first judges to use his computer on an extensive basis. And he was sitting behind his computer and he typed in the name of a defendant he was about to sentence, and he realized that that person had appeared before him several times. That person was a drug addict. He felt hopeless by the process because he had spoken to this defendant, sentenced him in so many different ways, and the person kept coming back. He felt that something had to be done. He began searching, and we ended up with Canada's first drug treatment court in Toronto. Now, Paul died on June 10th, 2011, and before his death, he had a conversation with Paulette Walker. And those of you who attended the seminar in May would have heard Paulette Walker share her courageous story of dealing with drug addiction. And she talked about the impact of Justice Paul Bentley on her life. Well, he had a vision, and the vision, one of his visions was that he wanted to publish a book that had a series of stories of persons who had battled the addiction through the drug treatment court program. And so after his death, Paulette approached me, and together with Paulette, we worked with Annie Shaka, Tanya Corners, and Joanne Humphrey, and we edited a story, a book with stories called People, Places, and Things. And that type of individual, that type of defendant, that type of person that drove Paul to form the drug treatment court, that type of person that drove Paul, that drives all of us to work and try and develop these kind of justice treatment interventions. One such person is a person called Joe E. And Joe tells his story at page 116 and 117 of that book. And I shall just read a portion of it. He described himself as this. He says, "I'm a booster, a professional thief, a con man, small-time hoodlum, big-time crack addict, somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a day, a big-time crack addict. which in turn, of course, means I'm a pretty good booster. I generally am able to steal anywhere between $500 and $1,000 per day of retail merchandise. On a good day, I can get out with upwards of $2,000, some of which I can return to the very store I stole it from for cash, or at the very least, a gift card, which I can easily sell. So Joe talks about how he uses, he found money to support his addiction. And he said, going through the virtual revolving door, he said, one day I did something I had not done in a great many years. I asked for help. I reached out through my lawyer to the newly established Ottawa Drug Treatment Court and said that I needed help with my drug addiction. At the time, I was not aware of it, but I needed help with so much more. Turns out my drug addiction wasn't my biggest problem, nor was my criminal lifestyle. My biggest problem was me and my lack of understanding of me. And maybe, put more simply, maybe lack of me. And that is what the Ottawa Drug Treatment Court gave me. The Ottawa Drug Treatment Court changed my life. Last week, we heard Paulette Walker tell us about her courageous story. And I asked Paulette what her takeaway was. And she says, what helped me was the Toronto Drug Treatment Court. What helped me was a collaboration. It transformed lives. It gave me hope. Now, there are 6 professionals that you see on your screen, and they joined Paul Bentley to create what had never been created before, the Drug Treatment Court. And they will share their stories, their memories about him. They will talk to you about the process they went through and what they accomplished. What I can tell you is that somewhere between 1996 to 1997, my old age makes it blurry. I was somewhere between 3.5 years to 4 years call as a lawyer. I was working in a place called the Public Prosecution Service of Ontario. My ultimate boss at that time, Elaine Crivel, assigned me to work as a team lead in the provincial court at Old City Hall. And then Elaine's deputy, Prof. Michelson, called me into his office one day and told me that he was sending me someplace to go and work with some judge called Paul Bentley to operationalize a drug treatment court. I did not know what Prof was talking about. It didn't make any sense to me, but he told me to do it, so I did. What I didn't realize is that Paul Croft had been working with Paul Bentley together with a number of people for a long time, 18 months, to set up the court. Croft Michelson is on screen. He was formerly Senior General Counsel with the Public Prosecution Service Canada. He joined the Department of Justice as a prosecutor in 1989. He retired from public service 30 years later. He's currently Chief Legal Officer, Litigation, and Head of Investigations for a major financial institution, and he is responsible for my drug treatment court problems. And then there is Justice Paul Burstein. Now, Paul was a defense lawyer. He's now a judge. As a defense lawyer, he sat on the board of the Criminal Lawyers Association for almost 20 years. As a young board member, then President Bruce Dano told him to go to a meeting with Justice Paul Bentley and a few others in the basement of Old City Hall to talk about some new drug court. And now here he is. I have traveled to over 35 countries talking about drug treatment courts. Many times when I travel, I have something called the rule and waiver form, and I will always go to the rule and waiver form. People always felt I was extremely smart. What they didn't realize is that Paul Burstein was the one who drafted that form. Gloria Chaim, MSW, she recently retired from a 37-year career at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. She focused on collaborative, clinical, and research initiatives. The aim was to find innovation in systems to reduce barriers to care and improve service delivery and outcomes for individuals struggling with mental health and addiction. And she was part of the team that worked with Bentley to set up the drug treatment court. And I can tell you what Gloria doesn't know is that she taught me how to work with others as a team. Wade Hillier, Wade's early career was with street kids. He was involved, street kids involved in prostitution, then at the city of Toronto for 14 years in public health and the mayor's task force on drugs. He's worked in Eastern Europe on drug issues and then regulation of physicians and also regulation of retirement homes. Just like Gloria, he made me realize that there was more to life than the law. And then there was Brian Paris. Brian is a retired public health professional. He was employed with the city of Toronto public health for some 32 years. He has worked in a variety of sectors in the public health sector. He's worked with the Toronto Needle Exchange Program. He's worked with the Drug Abuse Protection Program. He's been a community health officer with the Urban Issues Division. He sat on several boards with Center for Addiction and Mental Health, Toronto Children's Aid Society, Melbourne Community Coalition, and more. He continues to volunteer his time and also to help advocate for equity-deserving communities. Now, there was one man who has been responsible for my ability to travel the world and see the world. I've been to so many countries. His name is Antonio Lomba, and he is here. The man, handsome man in a suit, 28 years of international service experience. He's worked with so many different institutions, doing so many things, too much for me to mention, except to say he's worked in the area of public policy, justice reform, alternatives to incarceration, the implementation of drug strategies. He's worked with organizations like the Organization of American States, the European Commission, Inter-American Development Bank, World Bank. He has experience working with Latin American and Caribbean countries, EU member states, Eastern European countries, Uganda, African countries, as you can see. He is currently the chief of the Institutional Strengthening Unit at the Executive Secretary of the International American Drug Abuse Control Commission. We all call it CICAD. And also the Secretariat for Multidimensional Security of the Organization of American States, OAS. He has previously worked as the Executive Director for the International Development for the Spanish National Distance University, and also Director for International Affairs at the University of Murcia in Spain. And I know I did not pronounce that well. And he's received awards from the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also an award of merit, also from the Spanish Ministry of Health. He's got 2 master's degrees. He's currently in his PhD. Now, Prof. Michelson, you called me into your office and told me that this was a wonderful opportunity. And as a result, you changed my life forever. I had different plans for my career. You changed it forever. So how did this whole thing start, Prof?
Well, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here today. I should start out by saying that anything I say reflects my own views and not those of my former or current employer. You know, it all started with a telephone call, and that, as you pointed out, I was the deputy group head of the criminal prosecution group at the time. And I was in Elaine Crivel's office. Elaine was the head of prosecutions in the Toronto office. And we'd received a telephone call from Paul Bentley. And I didn't know Paul at the time. We called him back, and he said that he had this idea that he wanted to create a try something different, and something along the lines of what was the programs that were happening in the US. Drug treatment courts had started in the US, and he wanted to do something similar in Canada. And he wanted to meet and have a chat about that. So Elaine said to me, go ahead, meet with him, see what he has to say. So that's how it all started. I don't remember if Paul Burstein was at the first meeting or if it was just me with Paul. I think it might have just been me with Paul Bentley at the first meeting. And he expressed how he was tired of the revolving door in his court. And he thought that there were probably resources within the community, and if he could manage to pull people together, maybe we could actually try to do something. So that's how it all kicked off. He then started, reaching out. I think fairly early on, he had someone from CAMH, come and attend. Public health, the Criminal Lawyers Association was involved very early on. But frankly, without Paul's leadership and tenacity, it never would have come to fruition. I was actually really struck fairly early on by his tenacity, because he would schedule these meetings, and the meetings were every couple of weeks. And I remember going to a meeting, and he'd want updates on where are you at on moving this forward. And I remember thinking at one point in time, like, see, this guy, he doesn't know government. Like nothing moves that quickly in government. It's he drove the process and really pushed us to move forward. And when we would meet issues, he would look for workarounds. And so I remember at one point in time, he said, well, let's go on a trip to the Niagara Falls Drug Treatment Court and see how they're doing it. And we went on a trip there and had a look and saw how people were working there. And I think that kind of gave me at least some ideas that, well, maybe this is actually possible if you can draw on community resources. Maybe there's a way to do it. Now at a certain point in time, we did run into an issue with dollars. The drug treatment court concept, was fairly far along by that point in time, but there was an issue with money. People were saying they didn't have enough money to actually support this drug treatment court. And the timing was just perfect because it was fairly well developed. And at the time, the federal government had a crime prevention program, and they were looking for projects to support. And so I was in the office again one day, and Elaine Cribble called me down to the boardroom and introduced me to a couple of people from Ottawa who were looking for projects. And I said, well, we've been working on this drug treatment court program, and they got really excited about the idea. And then the dollars materialized to support the pilot project. But without Paul's tenacity, and drive, it never would have come to fruition. So that's how it all started. It all started with a phone call and Paul's tenacity and drive.
Okay, so Paul, you were the defense counsel, and how did you get involved?
Well, it's probably just to some extent, the flip side of Croft's story. I remember being a young lawyer, only out, I don't know, what would it have been, 5 years maybe, certainly a new member of the board of the Criminal Lawyers Association, Bruce Durno, who's now probably, I don't know if he's reached the supernumerary stage of being a Superior Court judge, but he's certainly considered and has been for more than a decade one of the leading members of Justice Barnes's court. Well, he was the president of the Criminal Lawyers Association back then. And I remember Bruce coming to me and saying, I need you to attend this meeting at Old City Hall. It's about some new drug court that Justice Bentley wants to set up. So initially, of course, as a defense lawyer, and remember this is back in the mid to late 90s, you hear about a new drug court, you figure that somehow the court and the state are figuring out new ways to punish people for drug offenses. And so I'm a bit skeptical about it, but I've got my marching orders. So I put the meeting in my book, and I remember getting an invite email from Paul Bentley, something that basically said, Bruce Durno tells me you're going to attend the meeting on behalf of the CLA, you know, and he gave a very brief outline of the court. And that's when I first heard the concept of drug treatment court, not just drug court. And I got the sense that it was something distinct. And so I remember trying to do some research back then, and it wasn't quite as simple as it is now by just Googling drug treatment court. I probably had to, you know, connect my dial-up access internet. I probably just went to my World Book encyclopedia in the corner of my office. But in all seriousness, I remember doing some research about the drug treatment court. And the one thing that I was able, about drug treatment courts, and the one thing that I was able to discover is that their patron saint, if I can call it that, they're the person who's ascribed responsibility for their invention was Janet Reno, who by 1996, when this all started, was, at least from a defense lawyer, especially a young defense lawyer's perspective, sort of pretty close to the equivalent of the Antichrist when it came to drug policy, because she was renowned for being, of course, first woman attorney general in the United States, you know, an important cog in former President Bill Clinton's criminal justice policy. But if you don't know, and you're not a student of history, Bill Clinton's policy on drugs is considered one of the most repressive regimes in the history of America, other than pure prohibition. And she was considered to be one of the proponents of that. And so here I am, I'm reading about drug treatment court, and this is the woman who supposedly started the first one in Miami. And I'm thinking, well, this can't be good. So of course, like a defense lawyer, I had my backup, because I think, at least back then, that's sort of like a professional stance that defense lawyers have, is they just walk around with their backup all the time. And I went to the meeting, and I have to say, I echo Croft's comment that, but for it being Paul Bentley, I just don't think it would have worked. And I say that because, you know, I come in with my backup, and I knew Croft, and nothing against Croft personally, I've always liked him, but he was a federal prosecutor. Like, we only met in court to do battle appropriately, but like, we had different views on things. So how could, as a representative of the defense bar, how could I ever agree with what that guy had to say? But that's the approach. And Paul Bentley had this conciliatory approach. The best way I can describe it is, he was just that, you know, that person in your family. I don't want to say, you know, the uncle or the grandfather, but when there's an argument at the family dinner table at Thanksgiving or whatever, he just sorts it out. He makes people believe that, you know, everyone is listening to them, that their view is going to, you know, be given consideration, and he makes people, or allows people, to see the common ground. And I think, but for Justice Bentley's involvement, and I'll say one other thing, but for the fact that this happened at Old City Hall, I don't think we can lose sight of that fact. There's something so special about that building, Old City Hall, and about meeting in that basement room, that boardroom that we all did. It was serene. It was, I don't know, I get just between that room and Justice Bentley, I think it's what greased the wheels to get agreement from all the stakeholders. So he just knew how to get consensus, is I guess what it is. And he knew where people had to be willing to give things up. So yes, without Justice Bentley, we would not have drug treatment courts in Canada.
So now we have the legal side of the equation. Gloria, how did treatment get sucked into this thing?
Oh, the revolving door that Croft mentioned at the beginning. I think it was, as Paul said, 1996, maybe early 97, that Paul Bentley approached CAMH, and in particular, my boss at the time, Patrick Smith, who was a very forward-thinking kind of guy and really open to innovation. and said, I am sick and tired of the revolving door of seeing people who are struggling with substance use come back and back in front of me at court, and I have nothing to offer them, nothing to help them move forward in their lives. We only have sanctions. And so, what can we do differently? And he raised the US experience with drug courts, which was different. And Patrick pulled me into it. And Paul just, in his, I want to almost say quiet, he didn't seem aggressive. He wasn't pushy, but he was tenacious and perseverant and very knowledgeable. So he had his passion from seeing people come in front of him in court every day, and he had his knowledge from everything that he had observed and studied and investigated. And he brought that to us and he said, so what can you do? And at the time, I was the clinical director of something that had an awful name. It was a group of programs that had been pulled together, and it was called Treatment for Special Populations. And it was programs like for people who had specific challenges with cocaine, women's services, youth services. And so this was another unique population, people coming before the court. And so what can we do? Can we pull something together? And so at the time, there was the opportunity to provide to apply for funding to the National Crime Prevention Center and look at treatment for people who had drug-related offenses as people who needed treatment, who needed service, and that by providing that and doing it in a collaborative way, in a partnership with the courts, we could prevent further crimes. And so together with some of my colleagues at CAMH, particularly David McIntyre and Bill Robb, who were the initial treatment providers and court liaison staff at once the court got going, we built a proposal saying this is why it makes sense and this is what we need, because a lot of the funding, you had no funding to provide a specific and unique treatment program. And so with Paul's backing and many, many, many meetings, those meetings that Paul referred to, with Paul Bentley's backing and leadership and tenacity, we met, felt relentlessly, and talked, first of all, to build trust amongst us. And it wasn't just, prosecution and defense. It was also treatment. And then it was also, and I know Brian Paris and Wade will address this, community, all the community organizations, service users and their experiences, housing, employment, all these folks, we had to all come together to think, what do we really need to do? How do we build a safety network, a web to really support people as they go through this process? And that's how this all got going. And that's how we got brought in. I want to say sucked in, but that sounds like a negative thing, but in a good way, we were like sort of scooped in there and never got out, because it's continuing to this day. And there are many courts across the country. And I always think without Paul Bentley, you need that leadership, that visionary who won't let go. And that's what Paul did. So I'll stop there because there's so much to say.
Right. So now treatment. Now, Brian, there was the need for some kind of community engagement. I mean, that's why you were there.
Yes.
How do you get involved?
Oh my God. I would probably say, if I remember clearly, it was probably around May, June, 1997. I remember my colleague at work, Alice Gorman, who was working, we were both working very similar on housing issues, poverty, and we were closely linked to St. Michael's Hospital. Being a frontline worker with the injection drug using division at Toronto Public Health, when you work at the ground level, you get a chance to really see what's happening at the street level, but more important, the impact it has on community. And I remember talking to Anita Barnes. Alice had actually told me, Brian, you got to go and see what mental health court looks like. So I did, and we got talking, and I found out that here's this judge who really wants to do something around mental health and addiction issues. I do not remember how we met, but I remember the first time we met, I think it was supposed to be for half an hour and then it stretched out. I think it might have been about 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And I had chance to hear what were his challenges. And also too, I had chance to share with him some of the challenges and impacts the community face. And from that, he said, Brian, look, we need to get stakeholder representation. We need to get community involved. And I said to him, Your Honor, this is a huge issue. And I'll tell you why. At that time, and Wade could allude to this, at that time, the whole harm reduction concept model was impacting us, both in terms of Toronto Public Health, the only public health division in Canada to actually open up a needle exchange site, went against every grain of constructive thought. At that time, if I remember well, we had Perry Kendall, who was the medical officer of health, and who eventually went over as CEO for CAMH. We had in-depth discussions on what could be some of the wraparound services we could provide. So when I started looking, and thank God, I have to tell you, even before I continue, it's not luck of the stars, but I think it's divine intervention and timing. We had people who were like-minded, who wanted to change the status quo, who wanted to be proactive and really bring about a change in how people with mental health and addictions were provided services. You have Paul, you have Wade, you have Gloria, you have Mike Namack, so many others. And why I say that, because one of the concrete things that really stood out with Justice Paul Bentley, he was compassionate, he was a visionary, he was a leader, he wanted to be a change agent. He wanted to change the status quo. Most important, what really struck me was the compassion and dedication he brought to this. It was just not about a judge providing enforcement, but more with a compassionate outlook. And I think that's when we started, along with Wade and myself and a bunch of other colleagues. You know, I'm a paper hoarder. So I have reams of paper that I could actually go back on to get data. At one time, we had close to 100 members of the Community Advisory Committee. We had people from housing, people from social services, people from the hospitals, people from daycare center. I included everybody. Wade also too. We had people from actually harm reduction. The harm reduction proponent at that time was huge, and they did not see drug treatment court as being anything. It was a mamby-pamby, if you wanted to say. And then on top of that, you have the 12-step. I think Wade and I had meetings, probably every week. I remember for 1 year solid, we had meetings every week. And that's no lie. Croft could allude to that. We had the operations committee, which looked at the whole operational design, and we had the community advisory committee. And Gloria, you could correct me on this. I remember at one time we had 6 standing committees. Women and children's issue, harm reduction. It was so huge and cumbersome, but yet again, Justice Bentley stayed the course. He was there. I invited him to the Board of Health. He came and presented. I invited him to some of the community meetings. And I said, you know, Your Honor, you could be bashed. So prepare for it. And he was calm. I think his open door policy, he was never one day hesitant in attending anything I suggested to him. Right. At that time, I think he was slowly changing from this enforcement perspective model that we thought he was to someone more with a social services background. And I think going to the Niagara Falls, like you said, Croft, I think that's what really was the catalyst for us to continue in this direction. And today we see why the Toronto Drug Treatment Court model has been the most successful in terms of having a restorative justice model and a harm reduction, which we were able to provide some of that enforcement, but at the tail end, having the community supports. I better stop like Gloria, otherwise I'll continue.
Well, I'm going to get to some practical, some nitty-gritty stuff in a second. But before we wrap up and go into the design itself, Wade, I'm going to leave you to describe. You community, political, I'm not quite sure. You just tell us.
Well, yeah, no, I'm not sure myself. I mean, I think what I remember mostly is that, working for the mayor's office at the time on drug issues, obviously, this thing sort of fit into that portfolio. But when I was asked by the mayor if I could do yet one more thing, which was to go and meet with this judge and to talk about these things. So I dragged myself just across the street and up to, I think, the second floor of this cavernous old city hall where, of course, there's no real reception. There's all these doors facing you. So it feels like you don't even know if you're in the right place. So I found the number of his office and I knock and I go in and there's this man sitting behind the desk and I thought, oh God, this is not going to be good. Just because I thought like this is just going to be someone's agenda to get something done that's just basically about self-promotion. And so by the time I left that meeting, I really realized that Paul Bentley was somebody that had a lot of humility. And that to me was something that I could connect with him about pretty readily and pretty easily. And based on that, of course, my tendency is to sort of say, have you thought about this? Did you think about this? Have you considered that? And so I think starting with that, I ended up then essentially being some of maybe the hands behind his ideas to sort of bring things together. So trying to give life to the sort of infrastructure that made the court pieces work in terms of the community piece and the political piece. So we would spend a lot of time meeting and talking about how we were going to bring together a community advisory function, how we were going to bring on board other people that were going to be key in terms of supporting this and making decisions. So that was my introduction to drug court. And of course, I can talk later on about how that grew because I ended up working for drug court for a full year, actually full time. So.
All right. We've covered 6 important components of planning a court, and this is just phase 1. Everybody's comments has talked about laying the foundation. You could see that. So the first thing was trying to determine who the stakeholders are and get into their decision makers. Everybody here talked about how some boss somewhere representing them instructed them, hey, go and meet and have a discussion. So if you go to the checklist, that is what you call the advisory council in a very loose way. Then number 2 is a scenario whereby you have to identify the court or the program planning team members, right? And you've seen some of them here. You have to secure a team commitment. That's number 3. Number 4, you identify stakeholders, key stakeholders. Gloria and Brian talked about that. Number 5, the problem, whatever problem you're trying to solve, is got to be something that you have to be aware of. Number 6 is a scenario of trying to assess your team for some key competencies and key knowledge. These are all things that require in-depth discussion, and it will probably be the subject of a future webinar. But now you have gotten together, and now you have to design this program. So I'm just going to throw it out there. Are there any challenges? Let's start with first. What do you think is a major challenge you faced? Anyone?
Money. There was a lot of desire, but not a lot of money. So part of basically my coming to drug court was actually the city of Toronto allowing me as a resource to actually provide some continuity for a judge who had a full-time job, basically. And it worked out serendipitously in terms of I was in transition. And so on some level, it was really a positive thing that the city in its own way contributed resources in an informal way. And then I can remember spending a lot of my time helping to figure out where the resources were going to come from this, including, of course, raising over $80,000 for that first International Drug Court Conference in 2001, which was, of course, a few days after 9/11, which is a whole story in and of itself. But resources was a big issue.
Yes.
I agree with Wade. Resources was a big issue. In navigating, trying to come up with something that, where you could, a program that was achievable within the political environment of the time. That was key. So I remember, like, Brian had mentioned the community stakeholders, and I remember we kind of went and we had a meeting with the IV user group, and presented them the idea of the drug treatment court. Well, they were like, the initial reaction was like they were opposed to this. Like they were big harm reduction fans. Well, a harm reduction model, at the time was a no-go. Like my going into it had to basically be an abstinence-based program, or I would never secure the political buy-in, of my leaders to actually go forward with this. Like, it had to be an abstinence-based program. It had to be working towards that. So, there was that issue. And so you needed to kind of get a consensus and something that was actually achievable within the political constraints of the time, and the money, and something that was actually achievable against that backdrop was critical to the success.
Yeah, Gloria?
So, I agree with all of that. And I think one of the big issues and one of the ways we tried to approach that was to think about what would success mean in a court like this. And I think we tried to pull away from a harm reduction versus abstinence way of thinking, and thinking about what is success. People need to, and this goes back to bringing in all the community supports, right? People need to have secure housing. They need to be able to seek healthcare and learn how to take care of themselves. They need to be connected to community and to family, and really feel settled. I think that quote you read, Kofi, at the beginning, like, I need to get to know who I am. So that fell on the treatment side, and thinking about how do we build trust with justice to say, we're going to work on all these things, and trust us, this is going to get people, help us. We don't get people anywhere, they get themselves, but help us set up a situation where people can really take the time to make the changes they need to make, and start to think about harm reduction in a different way, because all of those things, as they fall into place, will help reduce harm and will impact people's substance use. To ultimately, the court required abstinence ultimately, but to start to be able to allow people to stay in the program as they made changes. And yes, they may use, but to kick them out or to sanction them isn't necessarily what's going to be helpful. So I think those kinds of things, and coming together to build trust amongst us, to talk it through and not get the backs up, because everybody gets their backs up, right, when they're trying to hold to their position. So I think we really learned to work as a team, and I think that was a real big thing that we had to do.
Now, one last thing, because I'm going to go to Antonio, because we want to talk about the international work. But before we get there, so you've talked about all of this stuff, right? And in the 18 months that you got together, I'm sure you had to develop some type of mission statement. You had to determine what kind of the goals and objectives were going to be. You had to identify your target population. You had to come up with what the eligibility criteria are going to be, including some disqualification criteria. You had to determine whether it was good, what kind of court model was going to be. Was it going to be a pre-plea type of diversion model, or was it going to be a post-plea? I believe you decided that you're going to go with both tracks. You had to sort of determine what the entry criteria are going to be. And Croft, I mean, you guys had to figure out what the eligibility requirements were going to be, both on the court side, on the legal side, and so on and so forth. Paul, you had to try and determine how you're going to protect people's rights by the rule and waiver form, to ensure that people who were coming in still had rights protected within the confines of the program. you had to determine what the program was going to look like, right? Whether was going to be phased or not phased, what treatment protocols were going to be like. You had to identify what community sources were going to exist. I mean, there's more. There are about 18 steps that you guys went through, even though I'm sure during those days you didn't sit down and sit through the steps. What would you say was your biggest accomplishment? And after you tell me that, then I'll go to Antonio. What do you think is the biggest accomplishment?
I think the biggest accomplishment was ultimately arriving at a consensus with all the hurdles that were in place. When Gloria mentions one of the biggest challenges was figuring out how to define success. And at the same time, Croft is saying the only model that would at the time work with respect to the Department of Justice was abstinence. I'm just taken back to the number of meetings. It seemed like it never ended about the debate as to whether abstinence included or needed to include abstinence from cannabis. And it's remarkable where we are today with that issue, that it consumed so much time of the steering committee. But it's an example of how, but for Justice Bentley's sort of quiet authoritarianism and his mediative approach, that we were able to overcome what seemed at times like an issue that was going to scupper the thing, because there was Gloria and the treatment people and the defense bar was like, well, how can we make these addicts abstain from cannabis? That's first of all, it may not be scientifically valid, but it's too much. And Croft and the police stakeholders were saying, well, we can't sell this to our constituents, and it just worked out. And that's just one example of many. But I was going to say one thing that I think is still persistent in terms of an issue for drug treatment courts from back then till now, and I say that as a judge who now presides in drug treatment court, is finding a sustainable source of clientele. It's less so a problem in Toronto, places like Toronto, because it's so big, but in smaller urban centers, say 500,000, 600,000, that kind of thing, I think especially given how much resources are poured into this, it's really important that steering committees or advisory councils give a lot of thought to how they're going to have a sustainable source of clientele, because I fear that you risk losing your funding if you run into stages of your court where you run with a capacity of 10, but because you've graduated 5, you now you're operating at half capacity because you can't find new clientele. It's harder than you think to find that sustainable source, whether it's defense bar, probation and parole, bail program, there's other sources, but that is a key element that I don't know that we had given enough thought to back in the beginning, but it still plagues drug treatment courts.
Antonio, one of the things that is quite clear is that the struggle between substance abuse use, criminal behavior, the link, the struggle of how best to address that issue is global. It's all over the place. And because of you and Paul, we went to several countries, too many to count, to talk about what was a Canadian model in terms of drug treatment courts, but really what was the model in terms of trying to come up with a partnership of justice and treatment working together. So what I have to turn to you to wrap us up here and talk about the international component of the work and your memories of Paul.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Good. What a pleasure being here. All these wonderful people and names that I remember. I just want to say to start with that when I met Justice Bentley, he went straight and asked me who I was and what I was doing and what kind of job. And he was just, it was like a huge amount of questions, one after the other. And then I responded like as quickly as possible, saying what I was doing. And then he said, well, you are a leader. You can do a lot of things in the region. We need you. I just felt so important right away from a person I didn't know anything at all. And he introduced himself as a judge later on, I had no idea who he was. It was just trying to find synergies and people to promote things. And I wish it could be here, seeing that, you know, at that time there was only 4 countries in the Americas implementing judgment courts. And right now we have a number of 17 countries either exploring or implementing. So and I think the international community owes that to him when he started. I mean, the first contact that I had the OAS with a judge, it was him, and he kind of set up the tone, the path, the friends. I mean, he introduced me to, I mean, I could not name them all, but I mean, not only you, Justice Bentley, but I mean, Paulette, Robin, Joanne, Diane, Shirley, Shelina, Melissa. There's a huge amount of list of people that he brought in right away to work in the international field. I just, he's a person that when he went outside and met with chief justices and judges, prosecutors in the Caribbean particularly, but also beyond that, he just connected right away. He didn't need to say he was a judge, blah, blah, blah. He was completely right away respected. He kind of filled the room in a second. After saying a few words, I just, I mean, even the fact that at the end, when I remember that training that we did in Montego Bay in Jamaica, Justice Barnes, that he brought you there, and I asked him, you know, what are the different profiles of people that you bring in this time, and he said, you know, I want to have Judge Bentley here for whenever I'm not here, in case I'm not here. And that was like, you know, a shocking thing on that trip that I was, I mean, he really projected the whole thing even after that. So there was a continuum of cooperation with the international community after that. He participated in organizing publications, in trainings. I remember he said right in the beginning, we're not going to waste time in training sectors separately. We did that already, didn't work. We need to do teams. So we're going to train teams. So every single training that we organize, we need to have on the table the judge, the prosecutor, the probation officer, all the team together, or this will go nowhere. So everything that we did, the international community in training, just follow that path right away. Organizing training with teams, team building with the International Association of Document Court Professionals. That was a big platform. Without, I mean, if you don't know the organization, you would imagine that was a huge organization, but there was nothing, there was no money, no resources, no nothing, but just, you know, the International Association was just, it was a big name. And it is, it was kind of a, you know, carried a lot of things with it. And yeah, no one even opened the door to see what was behind. It was just, you know, here we are, you know, it's kind of a, I just, the fact that he was so down to earth and humble in every way, shape or form, he was so approachable, except from one thing I must say, he was very flexible with everything except from how do you prepare tea. Because I got that several times in Belgium with him one time, and also in the Caribbean, that you can only put the milk after pouring the tea and not the other way around. So the rest of the things in the world could be changed and adaptable, but that thing, it cannot be changed. Tea comes first and then milk. So there were some basic things, you know, that it was very clear that they should be there. I was reviewing the other day the emails that I got from him from, I mean, many years. And I just found a lot of them saying, hey, Antonio, feel like chatting? I mean, that was just the straight way to contact and to, you know, no email, no protocol or nothing, just, and that was the way operated a lot of things. I was honored to meet him many times, travel with him, also with you, Justice Barnes, and a lot of other people at that time. But I was so honored just in a few years to become his friend, family, met a family in DC and elsewhere, and it was just, it's one of these people that you touch you and you're touched and you're still touched. I think of him many times. I have photos of him, emails. And I know that as a fact. You know, when you go to Trinidad and Tobago, talk to a chief justice or the judge in Barbados, or I mean Jamaica, or many places that he was in Chile, you know, people still ask for him. It was just, he did a huge impact on the international community. I mean, he put us in touch with Judge King in Australia, with the judges in the UK, just you name it. It's just, it was this whole thing of International Association as a facade, has a huge amount of people behind, and he trusted people. That's all I wanted to say, in just a few words of how important he was. And I mean, I will support every single word that you said before. I thank you for inviting me.
As we wrap up this section, what I will say is that the Canadian model was actually very well respected internationally, and so was Paul Bentley. What I'll indicate to you, and I see we've got a quick question that I'm going to take, but what I indicate to you is this, that we're going to send you a resource that which will take you to a link where we will indicate some 18 steps you can take if you're setting up. It says setting up a drug court, but in reality, I can tell you from my experience, a lot of those principles are you can apply to setting up any justice treatment collaboration. So we'll make sure that you have that. In terms of the takeaway from today, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to pick one, and I'm going to pick Gloria's takeaway. And Gloria was saying that this whole experience, the whole planning, and this whole experience of coming together to develop this justice treatment partnership demonstrated cross-sectorial collaboration and the establishment of a structure to support it, including representation from treatment justice, and that is Crown and Defense, community organizations, housing, education, recreation, employment, child and family support, and service users is essential, starting at the developmental stage. Then she talks about the importance of spending time to build trust amongst the partners. It is necessary to lay a solid foundation for working through challenging issues. And you can see different people from different sectors developing that trust to move on. And also ongoing evaluation is very important. Attention to changes in societal and legal contexts, and willingness to adapt and evolve in response to findings that will improve the efficacy and relevance of drug treatment courts. And that sort of sums it up as a major takeaway. We talked about the vision, humility, and partnership that all of these persons before who are here today embodied, and also the man who led them, Justice Bentley, embodied. Before we wrap up, I'm going to have Jennifer Graham just pose that one question that we have. Is this question just going to Paul Burstein?
Your Honor, it's Andre Rivard. I work as a lawyer with Duty Counsel.
Andre, okay, yeah. Andre, yes.
And the question comes from Justice Ray, actually. She invites Justice Bernstein to take a stab at it, but it addresses the comment you made, Your Honor, earlier, Your Honor Bernstein, about funding in some smaller locations.
I read the question. Thank you. It's a great question.
Yeah, from Ms. Graham and myself's perspective, we can only speak to our experience in Brampton. We're currently operating a wait list. And we have the partnership of a federal crown, a PPSC crown that has sort of taken the initiative to create a new diversion program so that we can avoid a guilty plea for some of those clients that fit a certain contextualized profile in the South Asian community. And they're found with small substances. So it's a part of the new initiative with PPSC as well. But on the point of funding and on the point of wanting to be sustainable, do you feel like addressing Justice Ray's question on that, making sure and then be mindful of what Justice Bentley would have thought about in terms of an analysis of quality versus quantitative levels of success, markers of success? Do we want graduation? Do we want to make meaningful impact in the client's lives? I'll leave that to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm the one to answer this because, well, and I say that only because I'm not trying to avoid the question, but, the judge presiding in a drug treatment court isn't supposed to, and I hope, isn't usually involved in the decision about admitting people. They're obviously involved in the decision to expel people. And so it's not really the judge who sets the criteria. Sort of going back in time to my previous life as a defense counsel, I think I would have said that the criteria are either sometimes too strictly applied or too strict themselves. The real challenge, I think, now is that because the federal government has become, so progressive in its views, well, and I say that sort of relatively speaking, but very progressive in its views about substance abuse, there aren't even that many possession charges anymore. So unless the admission criteria are loosened, expanded, however you want to put it, it's going to be harder and harder for drug treatment courts to maintain a sustainable level of clientele. If they don't admit, the small scale or maybe not so small scale, say addict traffickers or that kind of thing. But it's not really for me to say. I just know it's an issue certainly in Durham where I preside. The other option that I know we've explored is to try and find, I'll say, other types of clientele. And what I mean by that is looking, say, to probation or parole to sort of have another stream of clients, because obviously there are many probation orders that are imposed on drug addicted individuals that have a term, abstain from use or seek counseling, and that never works. They just result in breach charges. So maybe if those people were streamed into some form of drug treatment court, even if it were just temporary for when there were spots. I don't have all the answers. It's in my current vocation, it's kind of hard for me to offer those opinions, but yeah, it's a great question that Justice Ray raises.
All right. Well, thank you. Brian, Gloria, Croft, Wade, Paul, Antonio. Thank you for sharing your time. You can stay with us, but this has been special. It's been several years, and thank you for being part of this. Many people, Paul is the main person, and we've talked about Paul, but many people are unaware of the roles that each of you played in making sure that this happened. And it's not an understatement that we are, the criminal justice system is where it is today in terms of working better towards justice and treatment collaborations because of the work you all did. And I do not know if you recognize how monumental the work you did was. So thank you very much. And with that, we'll just segue to the next session.